If we have less economic productivity, then you're going to have less GDP for the country. If you have less GDP for the country, here's the kicker. Here's the part that matters. You have less ability to pay off your interest on your national debt. How many of you have seen that lovely ticker from, I forget, it's like the Treasury website or whatever, that's constantly updating every second on the debt that we're in? Part of the reason we're at the stage of the Ponzi scheme where things get a little crazy is because no matter what, we can't pay off the interest on our debt the way a business would actually need to pay off its expenses. The way a real business pays its expenses is by increasing revenue, and if it can't do that, it goes out of business. The Ponzi scheme called running a nation in 2024, if you can't grow your revenues, you just con all your employees into voting for different policies that allow you to extract it from them. Sounds fun, right? Really quick before we get into the show, guys, if you in any way appreciate and support what we're doing here with the Conscious Wealth podcast and brand, one of the quickest and easiest ways that you can support us is by making sure that you are subscribed. This allows us to not only secure conversations with higher level guests on the show, it also allows us to attract the best talent in the world onto our media and content team so that we can continue to put out world-class quality content for you all. Thank you so much for the unwavering support. Now, let's get into today's episode. Nothing worth having allows you to have one foot in, one foot out. Anything that has ever truly worked out for me in life required me to reach that moment, that key moment where you either burn the boats and there's no going back, or you're dishonest with yourself and you stop bullshitting. So this is our first lens through which you can see the market. Now let's talk about the demographic shift lens. This is a lens I have a hunch more of you will be unfamiliar with. The fourth turning, at this point, anyone who hasn't heard me say that, you just haven't consumed my content then, because I'm talking about it too much because of where we're at. But the demographic shift thesis is a bit different, right? So let's really talk about this, because if you can wrap your head around this, how many of you, well, let me rephrase. For a lot of you, the main awareness you may have of the population concerns likely have only come from Elon. My man started speaking out about, the population actually isn't growing, overpopulation isn't an issue. We actually have a depopulation issue, right? So let's put our macro hats on. Let's imagine you work at the Federal Reserve, or you work in the government at a level where you're looking at the entire machine. You're looking at society as all these little ants, and you're thinking about what strings can I pull and how does this all work together so that society doesn't implode, so that I can continue to benefit off of this society, right? So top left, we have from the Federal Reserve, we have the labor force participation rate. Now, hopefully you can see that we peaked in 2000. Let me ask you guys something. What happened in the 90s? What was occurring as far as innovation? Collapse of the Soviet Union. Yes. Technology. It's an interesting observation. That's all I'm saying. So if this was a chart, it would actually look bullish. You would need more confluence, right? Otherwise you might have a bad time. To me, what we're seeing here, we kind of peaked around 67%. We're in a clear downtrend. Now, of course, we could start heading back up, but that's where you need to be looking at from other perspectives of, are we really heading back up? In my opinion, and from the research that I've done, most of the world is either underestimating or is completely clueless to how swiftly the working age population in most first world countries is declining. So on the top left, all I'm showing you is the labor force participation. That means people have to be of working age, which is a multiple decade segment of the population that helps contribute towards GDP. Because GDP, think of the United States as a business, wink, wink. The business has a bunch of employees. You, wink, wink. All of us combined, what we make, what all the businesses make, what all the citizens make, add up to the GDP. I'm just explaining this at a very simple level for you to understand. So it's almost like the business's revenue. Now, if you have less and less workers to contribute towards the productivity, you're going to have GDP issues, aren't you? So in other words, if you have less and less employees to work for your business, you're going to have revenue issues, aren't you? That's what I'm saying here. It's the same concept. It's very simple. So that's why, the people that are managing the United States, that are trying to figure out how to structure things and policy and blah, 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 it's a business. It's a business. GDP, that's the business's revenue. They fucking suck. If it was a private business, an actual entrepreneur would crush it. But when you give things to the public, they suck. They don't know how to allocate capital. They don't understand how to grow revenue because they're not actually business owners. They're not entrepreneurs. They're bureaucrats. So, bottom right chart here. The threat of working age populations. So you can see this now in a little bit of a different sense across different countries. This is pretty swift. So the top left, that's US. The bottom right, this is across different countries for you to understand, right? So we have Germany, Italy, Japan, Korea. So let me kind of break this down for you. If we have less workforce, then we have less economic productivity. Productivity is a macro term. I'm not referring to it as were you productive today. It's called productivity. If we have less economic productivity, then you're going to have less GDP for the country. If you have less GDP for the country, here's the kicker. Here's the part that matters. You have less ability to pay off your interest on your national debt. How many of you have seen that lovely ticker from, I forget, it's like the Treasury website or whatever, that's constantly updating every second on the debt that we're in? However many trillions, right? So part of the reason we're at the stage of the Ponzi scheme where things get a little crazy is because no matter what, we can't pay off the interest on our debt the way a business would actually need to pay off its expenses. The way a real business pays its expenses is by increasing revenue. And if it can't do that, it goes out of business. The Ponzi scheme called, I don't even want to say America because this is global now. The Ponzi scheme called running a nation in 2024. If you can't grow your revenues, you just con all your employees into voting for different policies that allow you to extract it from them. Sounds fun, right? So the United States, how many of you have heard of something called a debt to GDP ratio? So the United States has an issue with the debt to GDP ratio. Another way of thinking of that would be debt to revenue if it was a business, right? So if you made $50,000 this year, but your debt was $150,000 this year, you would resonate similarly to the condition that the United States is in. We have a multiple fold higher debt to GDP ratio. I believe it's around 3-1. It might have dropped a bit. And so I want you to think about this. You're the powers that be, and you're trying to figure out how do we not go bankrupt, at least in my lifetime, so I can still enjoy the things that I'm enjoying in this position of power. Okay, well, let's try to increase GDP to pay off the debt. Okay, let's check out the stats. Oh, fuck. They're not having kids. The working population is going down. Okay, there's no way we can get more people to do more work to raise the revenue of our company to pay off our debt. Make sense? So what are they going to do about that? Well, we'll get into that, but let me transition now to another lens of this. Population decline. Okay, so part of the demographic shift, part of the way that it's unique is that we're also dealing with millennials and Gen Z having a completely different temperament. A lot of, I'll say us, don't want to work. A lot of us don't want to have kids. And that's new. That's a new thing. And that is an issue at scale, right? But we are a byproduct of the world that we inherited. If you're a millennial, how do you feel about the world that you inherited? Pretty fucked, right? We can't buy a house. You can't afford basic things. Both husband and wife have to work. You know, it's not the world that our grandparents got to enjoy, right? So there's that aspect, right? You got to be rich, right? you gotta make it. It's your only chance. You're either rich or poor. It's not really a middle anymore. Now there's a different lens. Let's put on our population lens. Okay. So you're looking at the world through the most zoomed out perspective. You're looking at all the different nations, and you're like a Klaus Schwab, right? You're looking at like all the 8 billion, and you think that you have a say over all of them. So our world in data graph here, we've got our population growth rate by level of development. So the least developed countries are in red, the most developed are in blue. Now, it's pretty natural that the most developed country is going to have the slower growth rates, right? Because you're already massive size. Least developed, there's a lot of opportunity there. Opportunity breeds people willing to have more kids and people moving there and so on and so forth. So let's pay attention to the blue line. In the 50s, we were growing at a healthy 1%. We had a little uptrend for a bit post World War II. Start declining. We touch 0.5 around 70s, 80s. Then we have another swift leg down near the 2000s, but we rebound. And now look at what has happened the last few years. We've actually touched 0%. 0% population growth. And for anyone who's learned any semblance of charting, this is a clear downtrend. There's nothing to indicate to us that there's going to be a reversal in a secular sense, like a broader reversal. Now, you can't just look at this as a technical analysis chart, right? You have to understand, well, why has it been declining? Well, a piece of that is what I'm talking about. Our generation, my generation, and the generation younger than me coming out of like high school right now, they can't afford to have kids. Also, there's record levels of fuck you to the system. Why do I want to bring a kid into this world? I've heard that a lot. There's a sense of, I don't know what the world's going to look like in 10 years, so I don't even know if I want to bring a kid into it, right? There's a lot of these different aspects. And what's interesting and what I try to remind people is that this is temporary. This is cyclical. Humans have thought that the world was ending and it was all going to shit for a long, long time. Very long. I've posted the chart before, actually, of multiple hundreds of years of all the things that they said the world was going to end. You know, like you guys remember the Mayan calendar in 2012. There's been so many, the fucking malaria, the bird flu. There's been an immense amount of them. Humans are funny like that. But regardless, this is real sentiment, and it dictates life actions. And you see it. It's not specific to a city, a state, or even a country. This is nations. This is the world. We're trending down. So it's not as simple as saying, like, for example, I live in California. I'm not having kids because Gavin Newsom's going to try to turn my son into a daughter. It's not that easy, right? Even in Africa, Asia, Middle East, Europe, we're all trending down. Now, this is a complicated discussion. I'm not going to go like super into the weeds of all the ins and outs of it. But what I will say is, technology, outside of the sentiment stuff that I've brought up before, technology is driving this. And we'll talk about that as we go a bit more in depth into this conversation. But I want to ask you guys one question before we move on. If humans are not growing our population, who or what is going to increase the productivity, aka the economic growth of the US and of the global economy? Any guesses? All right. Glad we all have a sense of humor here. Well, this introduces our artificial intelligence thesis. Do you see how this all connects, guys? I didn't just pull AI out of my ass because I was like, oh, they're all talking about NVIDIA. Let's bet on it. You have to understand the fucking broader landscape. If something isn't a good idea over the next 50, 100 years, I'm probably not investing into it. That's how forward thinking I try to be. You don't want to invest into a market that's going to get smaller and smaller over the coming decades. That's what you call a has-been. You want to invest into something that has the potential to become bigger than you could have ever fathomed. That's how generational wealth works. The AI thesis. If you guessed robots, you're correct. The central bankers, the world powers, and the powers that be behind the scenes think from such a zoomed out perspective that, in my opinion, the common person just can't fathom it. Most people are very, zoomed in and focused on, them, maybe their family, the next week, maybe the next month. You're not thinking in hundreds of years. Well, these types, they think in hundreds of years. And they look at society as a whole, as a machine, trying to make decisions that will benefit their interests. Now, some things hopefully also benefit humanity, but there's, of course, bias in there. Now, from that perspective, a declining workforce is not good for anyone, because that means economic productivity goes down, which drives the US GDP down, and global, if we're talking about the globe, which limits governments' ability to pay down their interest on their debt as a nation. Is this sinking in a little bit more, guys? It's easy to have the conversation around blaming the Fed for everything, but the Fed, I'll be the last person to defend them from a moral perspective, but being logical and objective, they don't have really much choice. Their only options here are to devalue our currency or let shit break, because our population isn't growing. It's not going to go up. Now, it could, I'm not saying, 50 years from now we can't reverse and such, but I have a hunch the direction humanity seems to be heading. I don't think we have too many catalysts as to why people will reproduce more, be more social, larger communities versus less, as we're shifting into the metaverse, augmented reality, virtual reality, cyberspace, and such. Just thought. So, declining workforce drives productivity down, which drives GDP down, which means they can't pay their interest, but their interest is due every month. So the Ponzi scheme would have to end. Now, how many of you watched the artificial intelligence YouTube masterclass I did in, that would have been 2022. These numbers are low, but that's how projections work. These companies, they don't want to get, the big dogs pay them for their research. So if they overshoot, they're never hiring them again. Okay, so if you haven't seen it, you might want to watch. It's aged pretty well. I dropped it right after the first ChatGPT announcement came out. It did very well. And in that, I talked about the WEF data around how many jobs were going to be taken by 2025 and 2030. And so here, once again, this is very conservative because I believe the WEF stats were 30% by 2027. This has us at 30-ish% by 2030. But regardless, that's, let's call it 100 million jobs. So you can see how there's multiple implications here. One implication is if you're working a job that is not, let's call it creative, innovative, or a unique skill, you should be concerned. That's the most obvious conclusion, right? People packing shipments at Amazon, the UPS delivery guy, the person who delivers our food, the manual worker, the person who works on a car assembly line, the person who creates websites, like gone, done. Now we're not there yet, but we are already, writings on the wall. So it's like, this is part of why you invest in yourself and you grow and you innovate and you don't put all your eggs in one basket. But the bigger thing I want to talk about is what we're teaching you guys to do is how to capitalize on the opportunity. What bothers me about most of the internet is that I've put out hundreds and hundreds of hours of free education on all the knowledge you need to come to a conclusion to then change your financial life. And all people want to say in the comments is essentially various versions of complaining about that the world's going to shit. So what does it matter? And it's like, if you're so certain, wouldn't you at least want to become very wealthy in the process? Like, if either way, this outcome that you're so certain of is going to happen, then put your money where your mouth is. You want to complain about the population going down. You want to complain about wealth inequality. You want to complain about them printing money. You want to complain about robots are going to be, the Antichrist and transhumanism and all. And it's like, if you're so certain about that, you can literally change your lineage's life, use the resources, and then go be a voice and a light for what you actually want out in the world. So it just kind of baffles me how many people have opinions about these things, but they don't do anything. That's just my thoughts. And I'm not saying that to say, invest in like fucking Bill Gates and the Antichrist and shit. Ideally, there are things that, there are trends that you can capitalize on without sacrificing your morals. So, piece 2 of the artificial intelligence thesis. So as I mentioned, the solution to GDP decline, which is really a fancy way of saying living standards, just for you guys to understand. If GDP is not going up over time, then living standards aren't really going up. If GDP is not going down over time, if GDP is going down over time, then living standards are going down over time. So this is a little bit of a ballpark. Once again, I would consider this very conservative, but just for you to understand, by 2030, the amount of GDP boost that countries are expecting, or nations are expecting from AI, 14.5% for the US over the next 5.5 years, 26% from China over the next 5.5 years. Now, I want you to understand that a healthy year of GDP growth for the United States in the last decade is like 3, 4, maybe 5%. So 14% divided by 5 years, let's call it 15% divided by 5 years. That's an extra 3% a year. 3% is higher than the GDP growth that's going to occur this entire year, just for you to understand. So I know it doesn't seem crazy, but what that actually means is that for 2024, instead of going up, let's say 2.3% when it's all said and done, I don't know what it's going to end up being, but let's just say just over 2% for the 2024 fiscal year, we would have been at 5.4%. That's a massive difference when you're dealing with trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. So here's the other thing. That's not a broad distribution. Where is that 3% coming from? It's coming from one micro industry in the economy. There are 11 sectors in the economy. AI isn't even a sector. One of those sectors is technology. Then you drill down further, and a subsector of technology is artificial intelligence. And you're telling me that that's going to capture 3% of the United States' entire GDP growth? It's going to add on an extra 3% of the entire US GDP from this little micro industry that no one talked about 5 years ago. So it starts to get your gears turning. We're currently in the first or second inning of an all-out race to what companies and nations can not only implement, but master artificial intelligence. This means hundreds of millions will lose their jobs, as I've been talking about. Why? It's very simple. AI is cheaper to employ, more productive economically, and soon will be hundreds and then thousands of times more efficient than any human could ever be. It's almost to the point where it's as smart as the smartest humans. Then we hit that singularity moment where from there, within, let's say, 2 years, it's smarter than all humans combined. Try to wrap your head around that. Going from as smart as the smartest human to smarter than all of humans combined. Now imagine owning that. Now imagine deploying it for your causes. That will drive more GDP growth than, hundreds of thousands of citizens out there slaving away for you. Interesting times we're living in. So this is their focus, if you haven't noticed. AI. It's been very obvious, whoever's watched the NVIDIA trend and the shift. When we were talking about this in 2020, 2021, the market, Wall Street, the powers that be, they weren't on board with it yet. They were still acting like they weren't proponents of it. I'll put it that way. They were secretly starting to invest in it, but they weren't advocates for it. And now literally their baby, their poster child is NVIDIA. And I've watched that happen the last 3 years. That was not the case before. Just like, how many of you have seen how many times Larry Fink and BlackRock and all them came on the air and called Bitcoin, a glamorized means of value transfer for criminals, drug dealers, etc. And they would never touch it. And now they're pumping, they're putting all of their power behind it. Same concept. So to me, if you're not all in on this once every 80 to 120 year wealth transfer opportunity, you must be sleeping. You either don't understand it or you're asleep.